Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me once again, my good friend and partner in crime, Deb Romero, certified Alexander technique instructor. So today's topic is a little bit of a continuation from the last one, where this one is going to be titled Quiet Hands. And the hands are so related to the shoulders. This is a continuing conversation about the things we hear all the time as riders in our riding instruction. Shoulders back, keep your hands still, quiet hands. Or it's a huge compliment to a rider to be told that they have very quiet hands. That's And I think it's such a big compliment because it's hard to achieve. It's hard to get that.
I mean that, like, we just touched base on it on the last podcast about whether you're giving contact or an aid, and that whole relationship to the shoulder. When you're here, shoulders back, that is a backwards pull.
Yes.
So anyway,
So how we use our
Mm.
muscles generates force. So our bodies are force generators. So every force, if you look at it from a physics perspective and go back to Newton's laws, every force has a magnitude and a direction. And what I find is the magnitude of force is less problematic than the direction of force from the horse's perspective of the rider.
Can you go over that again?
What? Because this is a big deal.
This is a big deal.
It's a big deal, especially when it comes to our hands and our rein use, our rein contact, and it is directly related to shoulders back. So if we thrust our shoulders back rather than relaxing the ball into the socket, the way we have to use our muscles to do that is generating a force that's going directly against the horse's mouth. So the force is going, that force that we're generating in our body, the direction, which is different than the amount or the magnitude of force, the direction of force is going towards the horse's tail. As soon as we thrust our shoulders back.
That's a good way to put it.
And it's that direction that I find matters more to the horse than the heaviness factor, which would be the magnitude or the amount of force. So in other words, I can use the reins, or I can have quite a substantial rein contact with, maybe a heaviness between my hand and the horse's mouth, but they don't object to it if I'm consciously controlling the direction of my arms going towards the horse's mouth. Right? So in other words, my arms are lengthening forward towards the horse's mouth. That changes the direction of force that I'm creating in my body from the horse's perspective. And
I can just get this old wheel in my head going, oh, but then my reins will be too long, right?
Yes. Or my reins will be too tight, or my horse doesn't like rein contact, or my horse hates the bit.
Right. All that language.
Or I just ride on a loose rein. And all of those things, we're not really even, it's not even in the vocabulary of riding to talk about in normal riding instruction. It's not even part of the vocabulary to talk about the direction of force of the reins. That is like brand new information, even for upper level riders that I've worked with. Nobody talks about.
Yeah, because we're so into position.
Or all of the
location
instruction
instead of the forces.
all of the instruction I've had regarding reins have been about where are my thumbs? Which fingers do the
Yes.
reins go through? Don't don't break your wrist inward or outward, right? Have a straight line from the elbow to the horse's mouth. What other things?
Right.
Oh,
All that goes with the shoulders back thing.
and gently,
That
like
it's a
these are
position.
right, right. And I've been told your
Right.
fingertips should touch your palm when you close your hands against the
Oh my
ring.
gosh.
And I go, my fingertips never touch my palms. Like that to me is a tight hand. If I
Yeah,
close my
because that
fingers,
if somebody said to do that, I would be efforting and clenching. And that would be a backwards movement. Again, it just automatically engages the thumb, engages everything to pull back towards the tail of the horse.
yeah. And in researching like how to explain direction of force, it led me down the rabbit hole of sort of looking at muscle type, like types of muscle contraction. So two important types of muscle contraction are concentric and eccentric. And the more and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but my take on it from reading different research papers on it is if we look at muscle contraction related to direction of force, right? So because a muscle contraction is increasing force, that energy is increasing force through the muscle. So every increase of force always has direction and always has magnitude. So the magnitude would be how much or how little. But what really fascinated me learning about different types of muscle contraction is a concentric muscle contraction, which is a shortening of the muscle fibers and a contraction, generates an inward force towards the center of the body.
Yes.
And I thought that was fascinating because I go, whenever we're using our muscles in a shortening contraction, we're pulling towards our center. So of course we're pulling on the horse because that muscle use is creating an inward direction of force in our body. Does that make sense? Or do you think I
Yeah,
need to
and
clarify that?
well, from the Alexander perspective, it would be you're going into shortening. So you could even talk about it as in your height. If you think gravity pulls you down, instead of thinking there's a ground reaction force, and for all the force I push down, I get gravity pushing me back up. It's the same thing to me, that it is an inward shortening of getting smaller
Thinking that
than if you're
gravity is
just,
pulling you inward and downward. Yeah, to the point
yeah,
that it's expected that we shrink with age.
yeah,
And all that is sort of the habitual use. And it goes more with our instinct, like we talked about last time, not really thinking of our strength in our lower body and carrying weight or using excessive muscle use in the arms to do stuff, right? And
right,
and that is always going to involve concentric contractions through the arm muscles, maybe even the chest and the
yeah.
back, right?
And it
So
goes back to the last podcast of thumbs, already setting yourself up for failure by grabbing with your thumbs, and your forearm contracts, your bicep contracts, your pec tracks, then that just pulls everything forward and down.
right. So like making a fist is going to create concentric contractions all the way up the arm.
Yeah, into the
Yeah.
whole body. Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, just about
So
everywhere.
the opposite of a concentric contraction is an eccentric contraction, which is the muscle is still contracting, which is generating force, but it's contracting with the muscle in full length.
Yes.
And this is the difference in having good hands as a rider or not, is the understanding
I totally
between
agree.
concentric muscle contractions and eccentric muscle contractions. So anytime we're shortening, whether it's grabbing with our thumbs, like little monkey paws, if we're shortening our fingers, our thumbs, our arm muscles, and thrusting the shoulders backwards, all of our whole rein contact is turning into a pulling sensation from the horse's perspective.
Right.
And people do that. It still feels the same, even if the reins are quite loose and long. It's still a backwards
Right.
force from the horse's
Mm-hmm.
perspective. So a lot of people who think they have light hands actually have very short arms, which is creating the pulling sensation from the horse's perspective, but they have loose reins. So they think loose reins, done and done, I'm being gentle. And I go, nope, if your arms are still shortening, if all the muscles of your hands and your arms and up into your shoulders, even your back and your core, if everything is shortening in the use, it's always pulling against the horse's mouth. From the horse's
Yeah,
perspective,
it's
that direction of force is going against their mouth in the
yes.
opposite direction.
And we talked about this in the last podcast. If you're not focusing on your axial skeleton and pelvis to balance from, you're going to tense your arms to
Yes.
use for balance.
Yeah, and if we think of it instinctually, what do humans do in a high state of fear? We clench with our hands and we go to the fetal position. So that's an extreme version of our whole body going into that concentric type of contraction, right? And that's our instinct.
Yeah.
So I go, instinct never goes away, but we need conscious
Right.
control, because that human instinct is what makes horses feel panicky, restricted, pulled against, or, it's what horses react to, because it's a predatory instinct and a horse is a prey animal. So all of a sudden we
Right.
feel like that lion clenching onto their back when we go into that mode.
Yes.
And to be a good rider, you basically just have to overcome every human instinct and have a plan for redirection, because human instinct and horse instinct do not work well together. That's where things get pretty unsafe very quickly. So,
yes.
So what do we do then? Like when I'm working with riders on hand use or quiet hands, I'm talking about relaxing the shoulders, even a gentle slump, and that's going to take away the concentric or shortening contractions. And eccentric being the opposite. If we lengthen our arms forward, then we can tighten the muscles as much as we want. If we lengthen our back and we lengthen our arms forward, then even if we have short reins and long arms, we're not pulling on the horse. We're not generating.
And there has to be.
Sorry, go ahead.
There has to be some level of organization through the human skeleton to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Your stability cannot be reliant on your arms or upper body, especially your hands. Yeah. So when a horse, because horses can get heavy, they can pull on the reins, they can do all kinds of things. So the magnitude of force is maybe the pounds that we have to resist in a horse pulling on us. Right. But as soon as if we lengthen our arms forward, if we lengthen, I just tell people, I go, lengthen, imagine that you could lengthen every muscle in your body. Let's just do the whole body, right? That lengthening of the muscles consciously starts to create an outward force from the center of our body.
Yes.
So if it's coming outward from our center, then it's, from the horse's perspective, and the mouth especially, it's going forward in the same direction their head and neck is traveling, in the same direction their mouth is going. And it's that direction of force, whether the force is backwards or forwards, is what I find most horses respond to much more dramatically than the amount of pressure in the reins.
Right.
That
That makes sense.
they respond, the feeling of restriction from the horse's perspective, they can feel completely restricted by a rider with loose reins and very short arms. And they can
Yeah.
feel supported by a rider with long arms and short reins,
Yeah.
where they're not leaning on
And
it.
I think there's right. I think that it quiet hands to me is fluidity, like we've talked before. It's not a place. It's a constant conversation going on between the forces that the horses are giving us and what we're feeling in our bodies.
Yes. And that's really like, that's what's so amazing, and it never gets boring as a horse trainer and riding instructor, is I go, if we just look at the pure physics of it, we have a three-dimensional body, a force generator called a human, and then we have a three-dimensional quadruped force generator called a horse. And it's this interplay of forces in motion and how we manage the forces of motion in our own bodies and then teach our horses to manage the forces of motion. The more organized and efficient those forces get in the right direction, the less magnitude we feel, because
Right.
balance is really a zero sum of equalized forces. So if I have plus 2 pounds on the left and minus 2 pounds on the right, I'm equalizing the forces.
Right.
And
It's
that's,
kind of like me in algebra.
yes, yes,
It's making it equal on both sides of the equation.
right, right. But as horse owners, none of us want to do the math, right? Which is how you explain
No,
that's really the explanation
we
of
just
physics,
wanted
is
to
we just want it to work. Yeah.
just but I think it's important that you brought up the point. It's not a position, like we've said before. It's not a place. It's not a measurement. It's that fluidity of the conversation that's important.
Yes. And if we can't control our instincts of grasping with our hands, which is the thumb use, or shortening
Right.
our muscles, which is an inward direction of force within our own bodies, then we're always sort of working on a force level. The direction of force we're generating in our body is working directly against forward motion, working directly against the horse's freedom of movement. So when horses start to feel that direction of force, they can feel restricted, even on a loose rein. Even in
Right.
a halter and a bitless bridle, it's the direction of force that makes them feel free to move forward with some guidance, or restricted from moving forward freely. And that's the importance of having quiet hands, is that a rein contact, if our muscles are in a shortening contraction, we can't hear what the horse is doing non-verbally.
Very good point. Yeah, because any type of contraction shuts off those proprioceptors to send information to the brain. And like you mentioned it, we really have to unravel our subconscious ways of doing things and bring them to the front to get quiet hands, to me.
Yes,
Yeah, because it's
because
instinctual to contract your hands and pull back. That's just protective instinct. So you actually have to go and really retrain your brain on the subconscious level, bring it to the conscious level to make the quiet hands really happen.
yes, because the opposite of quiet hands is the human instinct to grab. When we're
Right.
in fear, we grab. And as soon as we even use that concentric contraction in our fingers, in that grasping motion, we're pulling. We're pulling inward. So we're pulling against the horse. And no amount of correct hand placement
Mhm.
is going to make a difference in that motion. No amount of thumbs on top or thumbs aimed in at the, same angle of the neck, or all of these different instructions we get. None of that's going to be very successful because the direction of force is overriding everything.
It's already been decided. It's kind of like not setting yourself up for success. You've already arrived in a contracted state, and it takes much more energy to undo that
Yes.
than if you arrived not contracted.
And it's partially an instinct for stability and saving our bacon to grasp with our hands. So, especially for women, like we talked about last time, shoulders back for women actually destabilizes the lumbar and the pelvis. And so if a woman is busy with shoulders back, you're going to struggle with rein contact. You're going to struggle with that connection through the reins to the horse all the time, because the only way to lengthen the arms and direct the forces forward towards the horse's mouth is if the lumbar and the pelvis are stable.
Exactly.
So I love that pinky thing you talk about too, that pinky connection, because that is directly tied into the stable lumbar and the stable pelvis.
Yeah.
That fascial connection going to the sacrum, all of a sudden, when we lengthen our arms forward, we can still contract.
Yes.
So if the horse pulls on us, we can resist with muscular contraction. I go, contract away, tighten up everything, but first lengthen it, lengthen the muscle, and then contract. And it's very hard. You can't even like make a tight fist if you've lengthened all your arm muscles.
Exactly.
You can't make that tight fist. Right. And then lengthening the back muscles also supports the stability of the back and the pelvis, the low back and the pelvis. So for me, quiet hands, I use the term soft hands.
Yeah.
Right. And those are, a rein contact is really intended for the purpose of listening.
Good point.
Right.
Not telling.
Not telling yet. That's a rein aid. Right. So a rein aid is where we are purposefully altering the magnitude and the direction of the forces from our body through the rein to the horse in order to help the horse balance or communicate with the horse or turn or do something, right? So that's a rein aid. But if we're shortening our muscles, then we don't realize that we're always talking and never listening.
Right.
And so the horse just learns to ignore us because they're like, wah, 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 wah. She never shuts up. Oh my God, she never quits talking. I can't do anything right. Right. And so they just kind of tune out.
I used to, when I back in the day, I remember trying to be this micromanager with my hands. And this one horse I had would always buck me off.
He's like, enough already.
And I could never figure it out. And then my friend would get on and ride and be, just, go do your thing. And she'd win everything on him. I'm like, take him.
No, and my first horse, it was just off the track for 30 days. Nobody told me that the more you pull, the more they can basically gallop, the faster they go. So on the track, the jockey is going to shorten the reins and they're going to pull a little bit to encourage the horse to sort of lean on the bit and get more power in the gallop. And that's a normal track thing. But when your little thoroughbred is running away with you and your instinct is to pull against the bit, he just kept going faster. And I was like, what's wrong? So pulling on two reins does not always equal brakes.
No.
Like that's a human thing, is to pull against the horse's face, thinking it's going to work to get them to stop. Not always.
Right.
Not always. And, horses that are ridden in curb bits over time, it's like a horse can learn to position the bit in their mouth where
Mm,
they can take control. So instead of having that severe backwards force, they can kind of get the bit organized to where they use their jaw or their teeth to hold it in place. And
wow.
then they just run away with you no matter what kind of bit you've got.
Yeah. Lock and go.
And some horses that are so used to being pulled against with the reins by the rider, even in a snaffle bit or a leverage bit, the longer that goes on, they either learn to lean on it and do that tripod thing where they
Mhm.
balance on both front legs in the bit, or if they go into a fear episode, there's no more leverage to use. So they
That's
they
scary.
just run through the bit.
That's scary.
hmm So that backwards force over time, that's what makes a horse, like we talked about in the last podcast, a man's horse,
Man's horse.
or horses that just run away no matter what kind of leverage you've got, or any kind of bit or device that should stop them no longer works.
I think that's a good point you bring up about the leverage of it all. Us and our
Mhm.
thinking, bigger bit. I need more.
Bigger
It's
breaks.
bigger. I need more instead of what could I do less of?
Right.
What what is the horse telling me by pulling on me so hard?
And that's such an interesting thing you just brought up, because that's what I find with horses over and over and over and over and over. Less is more powerful than more. But human instinct is bigger the better. If
Right,
this is good, let me do it harder, faster, more pressure. Let me do it more, 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 more. We have to practice. We have to effort. All of that is instinctual to the predatory mentality.
right.
Horses are not predators. It doesn't make
No,
sense to them. Horses are like, I want to feel safe. I want to feel comfortable. I'm basically a type B. I don't want too much drama. I don't want too much stress. Right. And so less is always more with a horse. And the thought of either holding the reins, gently pushing the pinky towards the horse's mouth, that changes the muscle use through our entire arm, our shoulders,
yeah,
down our back. And just that thought has helped so many riders change that conversation of force and direction of forces with their horse.
yeah.
And the horses respond really quickly.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah, because it's just like the difference between if somebody comes up and grabs me by the shoulder and pulls me backwards, that's a whole different deal than if somebody puts their hand on my shoulder and gently guides me the direction they want me to go.
That's a really good point. We would call that, how are you arriving? You know, what's the message you want to send when you arrive with the contact of your reins to your horse?
Exactly.
And they feel that energy coming right down the reins. Are we
Yeah,
in a
and sometimes we put it in the woo-woo horse whisperer category, but I go, it's really just physics.
yeah,
And that's what riding is. And it's like when you understand the equation of force, right? Mass times acceleration. So that means our mass moving is force,
yes,
right? And force is a vector quality. It always has magnitude and direction. So you can't get away from it, right? The horse can't escape it from our bodies, and we can't escape it from the horse's bodies. It's always part of it is the conversation. I should
right.
say it's not even part of the conversation. It is the nonverbal conversation, right? And this is way beyond obedience training, condition response, repetitive, blah, blah, blah. I go, you can teach a horse to do anything with condition response or repetitive stuff. But to really communicate with a horse, you have to understand how your body is affecting,
Right.
how the forces generated by your body are being perceived and affecting the horse's body in motion.
Yeah, and I think people don't even realize that even when they're just leading their horse, they could practice rein contact. You know, could
Yeah, or
I,
lunging.
or
Hmm.
lunging, could I think pinky first and keep my arm in length and leave my arm on my back? That makes a quiet hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think like most people, when I was told, keep your hands still,
Oh my gosh.
you need quiet hands, keep your hands still. The first thing we do is concentric contraction.
Yeah.
We tighten everything up to, instantly control the
And why do
stillness.
we think that, and that is so, through Alexander training, thank goodness we let go of that. But I wonder why we think that if we contract and get smaller, that things become more stable. They don't. You and I probably seen it many times. That's when people get ejected, or
Yeah. When
or
it
like the
comes,
drunk driver thing,
well,
you know?
it's an instinct. And even
Yeah.
if you look at dogs and cats and other predatory species, we all share that instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, that's why I think people are more successful with dogs and cats than
Oh,
horses
that makes
across the board,
sense.
is because horses, as a prey animal species, they have a completely different perception. It's hard to understand the psychology and the way of thinking from their perspective because it's so different. The equivalent is only like for us, if we're living in a war zone, suddenly we
Right.
feel like a prey animal, right? But prey animals feel that way all the time. That's built into their instinctual responses and their psychology. So to restrict a prey animal, where we think of it as cuddling, they're going to look at it as catching.
Ah.
Do you know what I mean? I got caught. Where we think I'm cuddling, right? We all gather in like little puppies laying together or little kittens. That's a big source of comfort for the predator psychology or the
Mm-hmm.
predator instinct. And so that's what we're really overcoming especially when it comes to hands. Because I think a while back you said something that has stuck with me so strongly, which is I asked you, I said, when people are living dominant in their fight flight nervous system, where do you see that show up in the body the most as a chronic issue? And it kind of surprised me. I thought you were going to say neck, and you said arms and hands.
Yeah. Especially forearms and thumbs.
Forearms, thumbs, hands. And I thought that was so fascinating because that is our grasping instinct. Even little babies, newborn babies
Oh
grabbing
yeah,
the
it's
pinky,
huge.
right? And so we never overcome instinct. It's always there. But in our relationship with the horse, and I think correct use of the reins or quiet hands, which are the ultimate goal for the high level riding, is so difficult for us because of that instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to really consciously develop skills, take conscious control of our body to have good rein contact or good rein use in a way that our horse votes for it, not the
Right.
judge, not the trainer,
Right.
not the human professional who's telling you yes, yes, yes. It's our horse saying yes. Our horse says, yes, that's better, right? And so if we don't consciously control the direction of our arms, or like you say, sort of just the thought of leading with the pinkies,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or thinking, okay, I'm going to leave my joints mobile and free through my shoulders.
That's
All
another
of
good one.
those,
Yeah.
all of
Are
those
they
thoughts.
available? If I had to move my arms, can I? Is
Yeah.
it available to me?
Or even the thought of, if we think of reins are simply transmitters,
Mm,
that transmission goes two ways. So to me, a rein contact is the moment we're listening through our hands.
right.
And a rein aid is when we're talking through our hands. And so just that thought too brings people's awareness. It softens up hands right away. rather
Yes.
than saying all of these gajillion different rain aids, or you're going to use this rain aid to soften the poll. You're going to use that rain aid to soften the jaw. You're going to use this rain aid to soften the tongue.
Oh my
You're going to
goodness.
use this rain aid to get this much bend for this maneuver. And I'm like, and there's no listening involved in that.
Good point. And I think that's kind of like what I was doing way back when, that micromanaging, that constantly thinking that we have to be in some sort of contractive control of the situation.
Yes. And I would say sometimes micromanaging, sometimes some horses that are really struggling with their balance need a bunch of aids rapidly. They need
Yes.
aids constantly, but I don't call that micromanaging if it's resisting the problem. That's the
Right.
aid. But the contact is listening, so you know which direction the forces are going in order to resist them effectively.
I think that's a good point. The contact and the listening, that has to be cultivated in the human.
Yes.
That those are the biggest, that's the biggest struggle I have within myself is, am I listening? Or am I just giving commands?
Right. And listening through our hands is a good image, but I go physically, we don't listen through our hands.
Right.
But we do, like sometimes if people don't understand that concept, I'll ask them to touch their horse's hair and describe the texture of the hair.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like when or describe the texture of the mane or the texture of their pants. So when we're trying to describe the texture of something, like if we're touching velvet or we're touching a little kitten, we're listening through our hands in that moment because we're trying to receive information. And if you just grab a velvet pillow with your fist, you're not going to really feel the texture of velvet. You're going to feel your fist, right? If you want to feel the texture of the velvet pillow, you have to soften your whole arm. You change the muscle use instantaneously. So it's a good way to think about it. Like even through the reins, can you feel the bones underneath the muscle of
I
the
like
horse?
that.
Right? So you're seeking information through the sense of touch, which is what I call listening with the hands. That will always make quiet hands.
Yes.
It will always make soft hands. And I find my fingers are typically half bent, maybe when I ride. They're never fully closed. They're never fully open. There's just kind of an elasticity to the fingers.
Right. It's that availability. You know, am I available? Is it available for me even down to my finger joints?
Yeah.
Am I available? Am I listening so I can make those minor adjustments, which is very quiet and fluid?
Yes. And nobody can see what you're doing.
Yeah.
But the horses, and if we imagine ourselves being the horse, it's the difference of somebody pushing on you or pulling on you. You know the direction of force,
Right.
right? And it's not something, it's always in our conscious awareness, but we respond to it all the same. If someone guides me with their hand or pulls me with their hand or shoves me with their hand, I go, all of those I'm going to have a different response to.
Right.
And it's more, again, it's kind of the direction more than the magnitude. If it comes quickly and has a lot of magnitude or a big amount of force, I'm going to react more. But I still might react just even if it's gentle because of the direction. And that's what horses are feeling from the rider all the time.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I can have quite short reins when I'm riding a horse, but the horse doesn't object. And the reins don't have to be heavy because they're short.
Exactly.
Right? Those are part of our perception is we gather up the reins in order to frame the horse, which basically translated from the horse's perspective means restrict the head and neck,
Right.
right? And I go, there's a lot of other options. If we listen through our hands, the head and neck will reflect the use of the back and the hindquarters. They frame their own neck once they're stable more mechanically where they should be. So the harder we make our hands, the more that correct mechanical use of the horse's body just eludes us.
Yeah, we can't hear it.
We can't hear it, and we're negatively affecting it.
Yes.
Yeah, so some horses get cranky, some horses get scared, some horses just shut down, and some horses get super dull because like they're all having their own unique responses. I can't predict how a horse is going to
Right.
respond, but I know it's not going to work well.
Right.
For the same reason I don't go around the grocery store and shove people or pull people when I want their attention. Doesn't go down well. So anything else you want to add about quiet hands?
Well, just that it's not a place. It has to be a conversation.
And what do you mean by that? It's not a place for the human, it's an internal conversation within
It's
the
an
human,
internal
or
listening for the, it's really, we have to bypass that grabbing instinct to be able to actually have a quiet hand and be able to listen to the horse.
Absolutely. And I would say I look at quiet hands most often, especially if I'm working with riders. The first thing I do is take away the idea of shoulders back.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing I do is focus on the stability of the lumbar and pelvis. And when all of the rider's concentration comes to the core and the seat, the arms begin relaxing almost instantly.
Yes.
Because that energy and that effort is shifting from the extremities or the appendicular skeleton back towards the axial skeleton.
Yes.
And it's like as the stability is increased where it should be, which is the back and the seat of the rider, the arms, the reins tend to get better and the rider's hands get quiet instantly. As long as the focus, the mental focus is on quieting those hands, it's freaking impossible.
Yeah. Because
It's freaking
we think
impossible.
quiet means stillness or not moving.
Or control.
Or control.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that.
No, it's having that stability live elsewhere.
Yeah.
And then the hands get quiet. Then if I need to add to that, I can talk about lengthening the muscles, then contracting. That's
Yes.
eccentric contraction, which will never pull from the horse's perspective. So even if you have to give a significant magnitude of force in your correction, the direction of force is still not restricting the horse. It's not going against the motion. It's not going against the forward mobility of the horse's body or neck and head.
Right.
So
And
they perceive that information a whole lot differently than if we're going against that motion with the direction of our body.
yeah, from an Alexander perspective, it's just, can I stay in my length and my width and still do the activity?
Yes.
It's as simple as that.
That's it in a nutshell.
That's it in a nutshell. Can I stay in
Yes.
my length and my width, not shorten and tighten, and still do the activity?
Yes. And especially there's, again, I think it's an instinctual trigger that when we shorten the reins, we tend to want to shorten the arms.
Yes.
So it takes a little bit of practice to lengthen the arms and gather the reins towards the fingers rather than pulling the arms towards our center.
Well, you know, there's a game we used to play, we haven't done it in a while, is if you have a partner, you can play with one person being in the front, being the horse, and the other person behind them with their hands on their shoulders. And just have the rider give direction with the hands and see what the horse says. and then have the rider give directions with lengthened arms, and it comes from the body, and see what the horse has to say.
Yeah, I know you and I used to do that
We used to
simulation
play that all the
all the
time.
time, and it is a big eye opener for
I think it's
people.
a great one if people have a partner that they can play with, because you
Yeah.
get verbal feedback, which the horse doesn't give you.
Yeah, so one person standing directly behind another person is putting the person in front in the horse's shoes. It's
Exactly.
putting them in the perspective of the horse. And then just resting your hands, the person behind resting hands on the person in front shoulders, those are your reins.
Yeah, and you could even get, practice being the bad rider by gripping and with your hands and
Yep.
see what the horse has to say.
Yes. And then switch.
And then
Yes.
switch.
And
What
then
does it feel like
switch.
if I leave my hands and my arms in length?
Yes. And that way everybody gets a chance to get the horse's perspective
Yeah.
and feel the effects of the rider. And it is an eye opener. And
I think it
and
is.
nobody was allowed to speak. It was not a talking exercise.
Right.
And if you wanted to get your horse, quote unquote, to go around a barrel or over a pole or on a figure eight, you had to communicate non-verbally through
Yeah.
just with your hands on the shoulders of your horse simulator.
Yeah. It's
And
it's a fun one.
it is a fun one because it really is an eye opener to the nonverbal communication and everything we've talked about with direction of force, shortening muscles, lengthening muscles, organizing through your axial skeleton, or trying to do the job with your hands or your arms. It even, horses are 1,000 times more sensitive than we are, but even our human perception feels it quite clearly.
Yes.
So I'm glad you brought that up. That is an awesome simulation.
Yeah, I thought of
people
that.
could
That was
try.
a fun game we used to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big eye opener. All right, so I think we can wrap it up there. Anything you want to add about quiet hands?
Oh, that all sounds good.
Yeah. And
Not a place.
ironically, in order to have quiet hands or soft hands or good hands or whatever you want to call it, you got to get your focus off the hands.
Exactly.
Ironically, don't even think about them.
It's-
Yes. Yeah, because the more you think about the hands and the harder you try, the worse it gets.
Exactly.
Yes. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another Horse Geeks podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, yada, yada, yada. And we look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.